Good morning. This is Jody Harrison. This is a presentation for North Carolina State University History 364 in July of 2024. This presentation is entitled Thanks But No Thanks, North Carolina and Federal Interventions. In taking this class, one thing that struck me was the extent to which North Carolina's forward progress was prodded by, or at least supported by, federal government action, and how almost uniformly ambivalent North Carolina was to federal government actions that worked to its ultimate good. There are examples of this ambivalence throughout North Carolina history. Before I get going, I wanted to make 2 points. First, this presentation rejects moral relativism and proceeds from the assumption that racism is morally and ethically wrong regardless of historical period or person's motivations. And secondly, North Carolina, when I talk about North Carolina and what their motivations and actions are of North Carolina, I am speaking of the people who were in power at the particular time. There were undoubtedly many people at various times within North Carolina who would not agree with the positions I'm broadly attributing to North Carolina as a whole. So, North Carolina and anti-authoritarianism, where did that come from initially? It came from the Scots, Irish, German, and other immigrants who brought values of independence and dissent when they moved to North Carolina. It also came from the religious traditions of decentralization and dissent, which can be found as foundational values in New Evangelicalism and Quakerism. This distrust of government, external government in North Carolina dates back to the regulator movement, which of course predates the revolution. And localism and anti-authoritarianism were both widely held ideologies in North Carolina prior to the revolution. We can see an example of the North Carolina attitude in the exchange of addresses between the independent state of North Carolina and President George Washington, where the state essentially said, we look forward to becoming a member of the United States, waiting only for the happy event of you altering the Constitution to satisfy the state of North Carolina. The state of North Carolina did receive satisfaction to a certain extent by the addition of the Bill of Rights, but essentially determined to become a member of the Union only because it became evident that they would be standing alone or as one of two with Rhode Island if they did not join the Union, so ultimately they did. The Civil War obviously was an example of direct federal intervention in North Carolina in the form of military campaigns and occupation. But there also were federal actions at the legal level that undermined local authority in the context of the war. Those actions included congressional acts, congressional laws that were passed, including a law forbidding slaves to return to their masters, and the Second Confiscation Act, which granted freedom to all fugitive slaves. There also was the Emancipation Proclamation, which brought freedom to all enslaved people, and the 13th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all former slaves, all people who were born or naturalized as in America. So again, North Carolina took great umbrage with the changes that were being forced upon it. Said if the federal government should attempt to even tarnish our honor or deprive us of our constitutional rights, we will be ready to resist and ready to dissolve the Union without regard to the consequences. And that, of course, was the position that they took throughout the Civil War. When we look at post-war, post-Civil War, and Reconstruction, North Carolina refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, which did grant citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., and as a result of that, they were placed with the rest of the southern states under governance in a military district. However, during this time, and with the assistance of federal support and federal intervention, Black North Carolinians made great strides towards civil rights and towards political participation. And another example of federal intervention is that the federal prosecutions of the Ku Klux Klan were essentially the only way that that reign of terror was ended, because local government, including the judges and the sheriffs, refused to intervene. However, then in post-Reconstruction, when the federal government essentially withdrew its interest and its support in the southern states, we saw the federal interventions end. We saw North Carolina very promptly return to a political system that was based on white supremacy, and we see Black North Carolinians once again disenfranchised, disempowered, and oppressed by the new laws, including the reinstitution of the Black Codes and Jim Crow. Turning to the early 20th century for further examples of federal intervention or federal action, we see World War I. Some of North Carolina's congressional delegation favored neutrality, even though the war effort did bring prosperity to North Carolina through federal acts, including the Food Administration, which helped to support prices of crops, and the Highway Act, which appropriated matching funds for the creation of a new national highway system. We see the North Carolina actually ratified the 18th Amendment to the federal Constitution because prohibition was in line with what North Carolina citizens wanted at that time. However, we see North Carolina refuse to ratify the 19th Amendment, which would have granted women the right to vote. That ended up to be essentially an act with very little meaning because the 19th Amendment was passed rather on the vote of Tennessee. Then we turn to the New Deal, which is, of course, one of the great examples of federal help throughout the country, and especially in North Carolina. The federal assistance in the Great Depression through the New Deal included assistance to farmers in terms of government controls on the production of crops, assistance to industry and factories in terms of cooperation among manufacturers and the promotion of unionization, and direct assistance to the impoverished, those who were living in poverty during the Depression, by the institution of a massive relief effort that employed thousands of North Carolinians. As Link tells us, between 1933 and 1938, some $440 million was spent in North Carolina, which was a huge amount of money for that era. So how did North Carolina respond? Well, North Carolina provided very little help or assistance to its own citizens who were struggling with poverty and unemployment. That was based in part on, at that point, the philosophy that it was not the role of government to offer social assistance or social support. Many in North Carolina considered federal programs to be nothing more than interference in local affairs that were resented. Social welfare was considered nothing more than creeping socialism, which also was rejected. And then they considered many of the regulations that had been imposed on business and manufacturing, again, as being overstepping of the federal government into the state and local affairs. Another great example of federal interventions into the business of North Carolina was, of course, the federal actions in the Civil Rights era. Those included Brown versus Board of Education, the case in which the Supreme Court in 1954 struck down separate but equal in public schools. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin in public places, such as schools and employment. The Voting Rights Act, which prohibits racial discrimination in voting, and the Green decision, Green versus New Kent County, which struck down freedom of choice plans in public schools as being unconstitutional. So what did North Carolina think of these interventions? Well, first of all, they passed the Pearsall Plan in 1955. That's a typo on the slide, it's 1955, which excused students from attending integrated public schools and instead provided for special tuition grants to allow them to go to segregated private schools. This was in a direct attempt to countermand and not comply with the ruling in the Brown versus Board of Education case. And this Pearsall Plan was not held unconstitutional until 1969. They defunded public services when a series of cases held that services that were run with public money needed to be desegregated and open to all. They either closed down those services, which included libraries and hospitals, or much like they tried to do with the school system, they transferred the funding to public funding so that it could continue to operate those services as segregated institutions. And then, of course, there were demonstrations and violence, including during the sit-ins of the early to mid-1960s and the Wilmington riot in 1971. So why do we see this resistance to federal action? Because of this long-standing tradition of anti-authoritarianism and localism that I referenced at the start of this presentation. And also, we can attribute it to an insistence among the state, upon the part of the state, on pursuing institutionalized racism at virtually every opportunity. So when you conflate those two things, what you find is that any encouragement or any compulsion to do the morally and ethically right thing by the federal government is considered impermissible interference in local affairs. And indeed, any interference that the North Carolina writ large, meaning the white male majority, did not agree with, could then be rejected as impermissible interference in local affairs. What then can we take away from this presentation? My conclusion is that North Carolina cannot allow fidelity to cultural traditions to govern its decision making or to allow politics to outweigh the best interests of its citizens. Federal interventions should be considered, indeed must be considered, on their own merits and not disfavored simply because they did not originate within the state of North Carolina. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.